Let's start tonight with recession fears on the rise.
Some believe we are already there.
Right now, we're in a recession, I believe.
That hurricane is right out there down the road coming our way. We just don't know if it's a minor one or Superstorm Sandy.
What is that? What does it even mean? And does it really affect us? Well, first of all, you should know that, yes, it does absolutely affect us, and potentially in a very bad way. In fact, according to a study done on the great financial crisis of 2008, which was our last major and prolonged recession, all groups of society experienced declines in their wealth, rich and poor. 1/4 of families lost 75% of their wealth, and more than half lost 25% of their wealth. Okay, that's a bit stressful. Let's roll the intro with some happier music. Thanks for joining me for another episode in my WTF is going on right now series where we make sense of what's going on in the economy in simple, plain English. And I'm doing this series because this affects all of us and you deserve to understand it. So let's begin by actually getting our bearings here. Now, despite all of the scary talk going on, are we actually going into this dreaded thing that we call a recession? Well, unfortunately, it looks like we already may be in one, and I'll explain why in a moment. But first, not to my own horn here, but I did start trying to raise awareness about the possibility of a recession back in February when people were saying that was crazy to even be thinking about. But now I'm just gonna, yep. That's a nice pat on the back. But hold up. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. How do we actually know that we are heading into a recession or that we might even be in one? We should probably define what exactly a recession is. The first way I would frame it is a crappy economic period that happens about every decade or so, historically speaking. In the United States, who is the current leader of global commerce, there have been as many as 48 recessions since the country was founded. So they're common enough. And some people would even say that they are an inevitable part of the structure of capitalism itself. But what is the actual, technical definition of a recession? The technical definition that most people use is at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. But for anybody who doesn't have a financial background, that's probably not very helpful at all. Yo, come here. Yeah. This guy, he doesn't know what GDP is. Get out of here, you idiot. Yeah. Not very helpful. So here's a super simple way to think about it. In the financial world, we tend to measure performance in quarters of the calendar year, meaning after every 3 months, we look and say, what happened here? And one of the most important things that we look at in this way is something called gross domestic product, or GDP. Gross domestic product is simply the total value of all goods and services produced in a particular economy over a period of time. For example, I really enjoy baking my own bread. And here's a crumb shot for all you bakers out there. Let's say I baked this loaf of bread and then I could reasonably sell it for something like $5. Then I would be adding $5 to the GDP. In the same way, that coffee shop down the street, the clothing store you recently visited, or the work that you do yourself, we all collectively make all these different goods and services that make up the total output of our economy, and this is what we are talking about when we talk about GDP. So we could say that GDP tells us something about the health of an economy. If GDP is rising every quarter, then we can know that an economy must be growing. However, if it stops growing and instead declines, this is where things start to unravel, and this is where you'll hear talk of the dreaded recession. If we return to our technical definition of a recession, then we remember that it's at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. For the record, so far this year, we've had the first quarter results come in at 1.4% decline. So if the second quarter results also come in negative, which they increasingly look like they are, we will be in a technical recession. Uh-oh. So what does that mean for us? Well, let's think about it for a moment. So 2 consecutive quarters of GDP declines means that for a period of at least 6 months, the economy is not growing and it's actually producing less things. But why is this such a bad thing? Why are we actually so obsessed with growth in our society? Is it okay for maybe things to not be constantly growing? And isn't there a limit to how much we can possibly grow? I think these are all great questions to ask, and I'm curious about them myself. But as it turns out, in the way that we have organized our society today, it is very important that we do have continuous growth or things start to break. Let me show you how the wheel of our economy works using the help of this delicious loaf of bread. In our wheel, we have 5 major points. We have credit creation, investment, production, consumption, and compensation. The wheel doesn't necessarily have to have like a beginning or end point. It's a bit like the chicken or the egg, so don't worry too much about that. The important thing to understand is that the wheel acts like a positive feedback loop. So let's define all the points on this wheel. Credit creation means how easy is it to obtain financing for something, whether that's for business purposes or even to get a mortgage for a home. In other words, how difficult is it to get a loan? Investment here means using money to attempt to build something that creates more value for society than the cost of the initial investment. Production means GDP, which you know by now. Consumption is pretty self-explanatory. How much of these goods and services produced do people buy and consume? And finally, compensation means when all this is said and done, how much do employees, contractors, freelancers, and business owners get paid? All right, now that we understand what we're working with here, let's fire up the wheel. We'll start under the context of good economic times. Now, in these times, credit creation is usually very easy. It's easy to get financing for something. So people are willing to invest more into building new things. People are willing to start new businesses or to improve old ones. And this includes me, an aspiring new baker who sees that I can get a loan to start my bakery at a very attractive interest rate. So I do, and Tony's bakery is born. And as I start this new bakery alongside many other new businesses or old businesses who've improved themselves, a lot of things, a lot of goods and services get produced for the economy. And this includes me, who's started my new bakery with a nice big cheap loan. I've been able to bake a ton of bread. Now, generally in these types of environments of abundance, we consumers tend to feel more optimistic. There's lots of things on the shelves. We feel really good about that. So typically, we will consume a lot of these things. We will buy all these things on the shelves, and my bread is just getting bought up. And finally, because of this consumption, businesses will make really good money. My bakery certainly is, which means that I have a good amount of money to pay myself and, hey, maybe even hire some help. So ultimately, at least in theory, the good economic times should flow through this wheel and ultimately result in good compensation and lots of available jobs. And because this is a wheel, it can spin again and again and again. And things, as long as we don't run into any major problems, they can just keep getting better and better. And this is why growth is something that's very important to our society. This is why our standard of living is able to rise over time. We are able to take something, an idea that costs an initial amount of money, and then we are able to turn this idea into something that provides so much more value to society than the initial cost to create that thing. This is part of what growth means in an economic sense, and this is in part what our economy is trying to achieve. But, oh boy, what happens if we throw a wrench into the mix? Well, starting again with credit creation, let's say it's now not easy, and it's actually hard, meaning it's expensive and difficult to get a loan or financing for something. Now what happens? Well, the first thing that'll probably happen is investment is going to slow down because it's not as attractive to take on the risk of these loans to start new businesses or improve old ones. So a lot of new businesses won't even start, and old ones will actually get worse and maybe even just completely fall apart and go bankrupt. In the case of my bakery, after my first really good year, I was planning on expanding so that I could increase my output, but now that times are a little bit more difficult, I think I'll probably hold off on that expansion. And so the negative fallout from this so far is that less goods and services are going to be produced and head into the economy. And this is where we use GDP to measure what's happening here. If this happens, if less things are produced into the economy, then it means that GDP could be declining. And remember, this is the specific part we focus on when we're talking about a recession. And then what happens next is consumers actually probably start consuming less. And the reason they do that is because they look and they see on the shelves, there's less things available, or maybe things are even more expensive because they're very scarce at this point. Consumers tend to get scared by this and they actually start saving more money instead of spending it into the economy. So at my bakery, not only am I producing less bread than I want to, but consumers are also buying less. Finally, because of all these things we just talked about, businesses ultimately make less money. Some businesses even go under, and ultimately across the board as an average, there's just going to be less money flowing, so compensation is going to decrease, and some people may even lose their jobs as companies lay people off to try and cut costs down to a sustainable level. At my bakery, because I can't expand and because people are buying less bread, I can't hire that extra help I was thinking of doing, which means there's less jobs in the economy. This is why we are very, very scared of an economy that's not growing. Every turn around this wheel, if less things are getting produced and people are buying less things, like I said, it can continuously get worse in a positive feedback cycle. And it ultimately means us, everyday people, are at risk of getting hurt here, whether in the form of decreased compensation or losing our jobs. And what I've just described actually closely resembles what is happening right now in reality. The Federal Reserve decided to raise interest rates aggressively at the start of this year. In other words, credit creation has become very difficult. And this is now bleeding through the rest of the wheel. I mean, just look at the stock market. You can see appetite for people taking on risk has gone way down. Businesses are cutting production and manufacturing indexes are trending down. In fact, about 60% of CEOs expect a recession in the next 12 to 18 months. Consumer sentiment is very low at levels not seen since the great financial crisis. Finally, businesses have started collapsing and laying people off. Now, two things might come to your mind that you might be thinking. And the first is, thanks, Steve, for ruining my day. The second is, how do I prepare? Well, and to that I would say, I guess you're welcome, or sorry. And to the second point, I would just say that I did a video which covers just that, which you can watch up here. But there's a third thing that I would throw into the mix, and that's that you may have noticed that earlier I mentioned the Federal Reserve has started to aggressively raise interest rates. And this seemed to cause all of these knock-on effects in our economy that basically messed things up for us. So a good question to ask would be, why? Why would they want to intentionally slow our economy? The answer is the subject of my next video in this series: inflation. What is it? How does it even happen? And why is it turning the last 40 years of our economy upside down? You have to tune in to find out.